So I recently saw Dark Phoenix, and this is the second time that the X-Men franchise has tried to do this storyline. Now, it's severely lacking on a few elements, but it's not the worst thing that I've seen. It's not even the worst thing that I've seen this year. So at least Dark Phoenix has that going for it. Like I said, this is the second time that the X-Men franchise has tried to do this storyline. The storyline where Jean Grey becomes the Phoenix, where she's possessed by an evil entity, or an evil dark desire within her. In this version, the X-Men go on a space rescue mission, but this supposedly solar flare gets absorbed into Jean Grey, and she becomes more powerful as not really an entity, but this substance sort of possesses her, and she starts losing control, and recessive memories start coming back, and she starts feeling all these emotions that were bottled up inside of her. Emotions that Professor X buried into her so that he could help her keep control of her powers. Some of the X-Men feel that she's too far gone and want to kill her, while other X-Men feel that Jean is still in there somewhere and they can save her. Meanwhile, some aliens come down to Earth, want to use her power to make a new world for them, and they're really the evil bad guys of this movie. I guess let's start off with the good, because it's not the worst thing that I've seen in theaters. Now, granted, my cousin saw the movie with me. He thought it was completely awful. And I can see why, but I've also seen far worse movies out there. So this is definitely meh in comparison to the bad movies I've seen. Overall, I think the action was done well in the movie. There are far better action sequences in action movies and far better action sequences in superhero movies out there. But overall, it was okay action. And even the last act of the movie, the train scene, I thought all the action in that scene was done very well. In fact, it was the best action sequence in the movie, and it is the last action sequence of the movie. So at least it ended with a good sequence. Overall, I think the acting was completely fine and serviceable. Granted, there are definitely some weaker performances in this movie, especially with some of the supporting cast of the X-Men and a few others, but I'll go into that detail a little bit more with the bad of the film. But at least they were balanced out with a few good performances and actors that tried their best with the material that they're given. James McAvoy as Professor Xavier and Michael Fassbender as Magneto, they are still very good in this movie and they give the best performances. And I also liked Nicholas Hoult. He's given a little bit more emotional scenes in this movie, and he tries the best with the material he's given. He's not given the best material, but he's a fine actor and he does good in the movie. I feel those three performances in particular helped balance out the bad and the mediocre from the rest of the cast. The editing was completely fine, the cinematography was fine, the score was fine. A lot of things was just completely fine and serviceable. And while that doesn't sound like a big positive thing for a movie, it is still positive enough to keep it from being bad or awful, in my opinion. And while there were some visual effects that weren't so good, it was balanced out with some of the visual effects that were good, so that was serviceable as well. Like I said before, when it comes to the bad, there was some acting that was either mediocre or just plain bad. Now, I've seen worse performances in worse movies, but as far as a mainstream, big, blockbuster film, some of these performances were pretty weak. To name a few, I feel that Sophie Turner didn't do a good job as Jean Grey, or at least did a good job with the emotional conflict that her character is going through in this movie. I also feel that Ty Sheridan as Scott/Cyclops was one of the weaker performances in the movie. And surprisingly, Jessica Chastain as like the evil alien main villain of the film was not all that good either. So those were a few of the weaker performances. There were a lot more, but those are the ones that stood out to me. I honestly didn't like the whole alien plot in this movie and them being the major bad guys of the film. I kind of get it because they need to have some other bad guy other than Jean Grey, because we want to have hope that she's a good person and that she'll turn out good in the end, which I kind of wish that was more of the conflict of the movie, especially if Sophie Turner did a better job as that character and with that conflict. The aliens were just sort of this extra thing to add into the movie to try to make them the main bad guys rather than Jean Grey being the main antagonist of the film. Plus, the introduction of aliens this late in the franchise is kind of weird and feels like a totally different movie. The movie really relies on you being completely invested and really caring about the X-Men from previous films, because it doesn't really have enough going for it for you to care about the characters within the movie. It just expects you to like them and care about their relationships from previous films. Unfortunately, it's been so long since the last X-Men movie that I didn't really care too much about these characters or their relationships, so ultimately the movie felt like it was pretty empty and void of emotion, despite emotion being a major aspect of the film, especially with some character deaths and some conflict between relationships. But unfortunately, there wasn't enough for me to really care about that in this movie, which is unfortunate. Now, granted, if you've liked all the other X-Men movies before this and you're completely invested in these characters and their relationships, those scenes might actually work for you. It didn't work for me because I'd rather the movie itself make us care about these characters and their relationships rather than relying on previous movies. And while I liked the whole train sequence at the end of the film, the ultimate climax of the film, the way that the villain is defeated, is one of the most cliched ways to kill off a villain. And I knew it was coming way before that even happened. Like, as soon as it's stated that the villain could take Jean Grey's powers, I realized, wow, I know exactly how this villain is going to die, and sure enough, they used that cliche. Now, I know a lot of people really love Days of Future Past. I like it too, but it's not one of my favorites, and I have some issues with that. But I will say that it ended with a certain thing happening in the timeline. And I was expecting this movie to, end in a way where that timeline would still exist. But it doesn't end like that. It basically screws up the whole timeline of this X-Men franchise. Plus, I think it even demeans Apocalypse a little at the end. When in Apocalypse, you see glimpses of Jean Grey as the Phoenix, how she gets powerful. But in this movie, she gets those powers from an alien entity or this alien substance gets absorbed into her. So I guess that really wasn't her being the Phoenix in Apocalypse at the end. In the end, I don't think the Dark Phoenix is completely awful. Now, Wolverine Origins, that's another story. If you want to talk about awful X-Men movies, look no further than Wolverine Origins. I think at worst, Dark Phoenix is a bland, mediocre, uninspired superhero movie. for the most part, it's just an average superhero movie in comparison to others. And at best, you might end up enjoying it if you actually are invested in the characters and their relationships. It might make it a little bit more impactful for you. So it probably deserves more of a 2-star rating, but I enjoyed enough of it, and I feel it's average enough for me to give it 2.5 stars. So, did you see Dark Phoenix? What'd you think about it? Go ahead and comment below. And if you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe and check out my movie reviews or countdowns of this year, of previous years, of whatever. As always, this is Bruce Gifford, and this was Just My Opinion.